Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us on a Friday morning. My name is Ophir Gutelzon. I am the co-founder and I'm running Unacceptable from San Francisco and area, Bay Area. We have with us today Alon Pinkas that some of you know from TV, from shows, from reading Haaretz, or just because he was a general counsel for Israel in New York. I will start and quickly just with where we are today. We are on day, I think, 161 since October 7th, when Hamas brutally attacked, in a surprising attack, Israel. And killed murdered, slaughtered over 1,200 people since then, and kidnapped 250. We are 161 day, and all the hostages are not home yet. We have another 134 hostages still in captivity in Hamas. We will probably talk about the deal that is now on the table soon, and the role of the US in actually achieving those efforts. And we are also seeing the relationship with the US degrading since the peak that we had on the day of October 7, where President Biden and the administration did everything they can to help Israel, and are still doing that. We are also seeing a huge escalation on the front of the opinion around the world about Israel, mostly because we don't talk about the day after, and we are still seeing a lot of horrible picture of people. People in Gaza who are starving, humanitarian crisis, people are dying, obviously. And the war doesn't seem like it's come to an end soon. So that's just, I probably forgot a lot of other details, but we're going to cover them during the call, during the Zoom. Okay, so before I start, again, thank you, Alon, for being with us. Ben is co-hosting if you need any help. We are taking questions on the chat. We only see it on, only the co-host and the host are seeing it. And I will try to pick up the themes on the last 20 minutes of our discussion. And reminder, next week we are hosting Yair Golan, and Ben will put the link into the chat. Alon, you have been doing this for probably every day, couple of times a day, on Zooms, on video, on television. And every day seems like we are in a new stage of escalation. When we set up the meeting a week ago, you told me, don't set up the title for the call because you don't know what will happen. Let's wait 2 days before the call. And we only had to wait 1 day before the call when Senator Schumer came up with his statement on the Senate floor. So let's take 10 minutes and describe in your own words, where are we now? How did we get here? And we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Ophir. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's an honor to be with you. And no, Ophir, I'm trying not to do these twice a day. It's exhausting, and honestly, even though you speak to different people every time, you seem to nauseate yourself because you think you're saying the same thing to the same people constantly. And that sort of answers your question. 161 days into this war, and you see 2 or 3 trajectories that you can discern. The first is that the war's intensity has been significantly lowered. The war in the sense that existed in November, December, and into January has been dwindling down ever since. And right now, there's hardly any military activity going on in Gaza. There is a lot of brinkmanship escalation going on in Lebanon, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But in Gaza, nothing major is going on. Aside from incessant Israeli threats to invade Rafah at the southern tip of the Gaza Strip, where approximately 1.4 million Palestinians are concentrated, at least half of which fled from the north when Israel initiated the invasion. The second trajectory, well, there are three trajectories actually, but the second trajectory relates to basically the topic of our conversation, and that is an ongoing crisis between Israel and the US. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but we are far away from where we were either on the 10th of October when President Biden spoke in the White House, or the 18th of October when he visited Israel. You see now friction, you see several focal points of profound disagreements. You see an Israeli prime minister who's not only defiant, but is determined to seek a confrontation and a showdown with President Biden. We can talk about that a little bit later. And so you see right now, Mr. Netanyahu looking for that confrontation, while the American administration seems to be somewhat disoriented in terms of what to do next. If you've noticed, and I'm sure most people on this call have noticed, in the last 2-3 weeks, you've heard virtually nothing from the White House on Biden's plan on post-war Gaza, on the Palestinian state, on an international force. None of that that was used so profusely in December and January and into February. You've barely been hearing those terms and those concepts in the last 2-3 weeks. The third trajectory, or the third trend is a better word here, is that of not even increased, but almost total isolation that Israel finds itself globally. I mean, aside from the US, that ostensibly and formally still assists Israel, both materially, militarily, and politically / diplomatically, Israel is isolated in terms of public support in the world. You have leaders, either presidents or prime ministers of friendly countries, who still pay tribute to the idea that Israel has a right to defend itself, the French, the British, the Germans, but you see very little in terms of support for Israel's recent actions. And that has to do, and I will stop here and allow you to lead the conversation, Ophir, and that has to do with something that has been actually, that has actually, I'm sorry, characterized the war from day one, and that is that it did not have, does not have, and I don't see it having clearly defined, coherent political goals. It's as if Israel is doing an experiment in finding a war that has no political objectives. Usually, a war is, the continuation of policy by other means, et cetera, as Clausewitz said. But there's also a tight alignment, or a clear alignment, between military means and political objectives. And right now, not only are there not, from Israel's point of view, not only are there not political objectives, but in fact, every time someone, particularly the Biden administration, comes forth with an idea for political objectives, Israel either derides it, dismisses it, or ignores it altogether. So 161 days into the war, this is what you see. And I haven't even touched on the domestic political front in Israel, on the assumption of Phil that you're going to ask that at some point anyways. I'm done. And you're muted.
I was on mute. So that's where we are now. And the situation with that we are in today is kind of like confusing, maybe for some people here, because we from here see Biden and the administration taking a huge hit on their policies, which is obviously makes tons of sense about the self-defense of Israel against Hamas, and the goal of the ability to return over 130,000 displaced people to their homes, both in the north and in the south. And maybe you can share, what does it look like in Israel? I mean, like in Israel, from a point of view of Israelis, Biden was in the first couple of days or the first couple of weeks was like the most amazing hero. What does it look like today when Netanyahu, who is speaking about Biden or the administration? I mean, when now Biden is giving us some tough love and trying to drive us into a situation where there is more security in the whole region and the big normalization with Saudi and others.
To be honest, Ophir, I don't see the tough love yet. I see a lot of statements. I see a lot of implicit or thinly veiled threats. I see a lot of leaks that we intend to do A, B, or C if Israel doesn't do 1, 2, or 3, but that hasn't transitioned from rhetoric to policy yet. So you see a lot of initiatives in Congress. You see a lot of criticism in the media. I'm talking about the U.S., obviously. And you see a lot of frustration and disappointment inside the administration and amongst Israel's friends on Capitol Hill in Congress. We began with, you began, I'm sorry, with quoting Majority Leader Chuck Schumer from New York, saying what he said yesterday about Israel basically going nowhere and in need of a change of leadership. But from an Israeli point of view, I have to say, and again, this may be disappointing to many of you as it is to me, that people took for granted what Biden gave Israel as if he owes Israel anything. They took for granted his pledges of support and indeed his unwavering and almost unbalanced support for Israel. But they are completely indifferent to or oblivious to the hits that he's taking for exactly that support or for exactly that policy stance. Now, he is taking hits on 3 or 4 different fronts. I mean, they're all entwined, but they are separate. He's taking a domestic hit, as you all know, in terms of public polls. Everyone now knows about Dearborn, Michigan, and the Arab American community in Michigan and how close he is to losing the swing state of Michigan. If 20% of the Arab American vote in Michigan stays home, that's enough to change the election outcome in that state. But it's not limited to Michigan. You look at the African American community, and he's in trouble there, and people cite Gaza. It comes from a different place. It comes from identity politics and the white Jews and the colored Palestinians and all these terms that belong in identity political discourse. But most importantly, he's taking a hit amongst young voters, 18 to 40, where Israel's position is at a low time, is at an all-time low. If you just look at the Gallup poll from last week, support for Israel is at 58%, down from 68% just a year ago. Okay, so that's one front, the domestic front. The second front is that he's taking a lot of heat internationally. The U.S., by extension of Israel's isolation, the U.S. is isolated for being the only one supporting Israel. And so in that respect, he's also the U.S.'s position in the world is tarnished because a lot of people are asking, in the world, not in the U.S., why is it that he is allowing, I mean, we compared his policy on Gaza to his policy on Ukraine, on the Russian invasion of Ukraine since February 2022. And he's basically, according to some NATO members, he's allowing Israel to do things that he stood up to Russia for doing. Now, I'm not saying they're right in comparing Russia to Israel, but it is what it is. The third And perhaps most alarming, of course, the political is alarming in an election year, 8 months away, but there's a third circle where he's taking the heat, and that is amongst allies who look at the way the administration is dealing with supposedly a staunch ally, a breakable alliance, a special relationship. Israel is a strategic asset, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he can't force Israel to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. And he can't affect behavioral change in terms of the conduct and prosecution of the war. And so you have people in Japan and in South Korea and even in NATO who are saying, well, if these are the levers the levers that are available to him, and he's not using it, what does that say about America's real power? If a staunch ally like Israel, who relies heavily and is dependent on the U.S., defies the U.S. And behaves in a completely intransigent way for 5 whole months or over 5 full months. So back to the thrust of your question. People here are, I'm not saying a majority, but some people, because the polls indicate differently, because Mr. Netanyahu is extraordinarily weak and fragile in the polls. But people don't seriously appreciate the heat that the U.S. is taking because of Biden's pro-Israel position or his so-called unwavering support for Israel. And more importantly, they don't make the connection that only a strong America, which is perceived as being strong, is by extension a strong Israel. They seem to buy into Mr. Netanyahu's bogus fabrication of I'm standing up to American pressure. There has been no American pressure, and had there been real American pressure, Mr. Netanyahu, you would not be standing up to it. So this is all smoke and mirrors. But you have to understand something, and most of you know this. You don't need me to tell you this. People don't think about foreign policy. People don't think about strategy. People are still devastated, pained, agonizing, and humiliated because of what happened on October 7th. So the last thing on their mind is a Biden peace plan with Saudi Arabia and a Palestinian state. They're saying, leave me alone with this. Let's get the hostage deal done and let's destroy Hamas. Whether destroying Hamas is at all a viable option is a different question or a different Zoom call, but that's how people feel.
No, but that's an important point, because Netanyahu is first of all, I mean, I assume everyone already know, but maybe not. I mean, like, he is kind of like the only one who didn't take responsibility yet for what happened on October 7th. And the second part is that as you probably all know, Netanyahu is great in slogans and sending very simple message to everyone. And obviously, he's kind of like trying to create this illusion, and you can talk more about it, Alon, that he is the only one that stands between a Palestinian state and to happen. And the biggest pressure that is coming from the U.S. And it's almost crazy to think that Netanyahu is using Biden and the administration as the imaginary enemy that needs to be protected against. And there are a couple of videos on our YouTube channel that you can see about it. But maybe, again, talk about, Alon, about the plan that Biden was putting in and the plan that Netanyahu doesn't have, and is kind of like trying to time and play on time, and why?
Okay, first of all, Ophir, it's not crazy at all, because anyone who knows Netanyahu and knows how he operates and knows his MO and knows his recklessness and callousness in conducting policy knew as early as late October or early November that he is deliberately headed to a confrontation with Biden. And what seemed to be beyond people's comprehension, because it didn't make sense, makes perfect sense to Mr. Netanyahu. And unfortunately, and I say this with with real sorrow and regret, the last people to realize that they were manipulated and conned were the people in the Biden administration. And it's unfortunate because all Biden needed to do was to make 2 phone calls, one to Bill Clinton and one to Barack Obama, to find out how Netanyahu works. On top of which, his 30-year experience, as he claims, dealing with Mr. Netanyahu. Now, this goes to something, I mean, the question is, why is he doing this? Well, there are 2 reasons for that, and you touched one of them, Ophir. The first is he needs to get away from October 7th. I mean, it's the worst debacle in Israeli history. It's the worst day in Jewish history since 1945. It's the worst day in Israel's history. Not only did he not take responsibility, not only is he unwilling to be held accountable, not only has he shown any remorse or any rethinking about his role there and the government's role in his role in strengthening Hamas just to weaken the Palestinian Authority so he could have a pretext and an excuse not to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority. Not only is he not doing that, but he needed to invent a parallel universe narrative in which this is really not about October 7th. I was misled on October 7th. The IDF failed me. The Shabak, the General Security Service, did not provide accurate intelligence. But ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Israelis, this is not about October 7th. This is about a Palestinian state. The world is trying to superimpose a Palestinian state on us. Do you understand what a Palestinian state means? It means 7 more October 7s in the next 7 months. Who in his right mind would agree to that? And he's been hammering and driving this false, fabricated, bogus narrative ever since. And again, I say it again without any gloating, just because I thought it would happen a long time ago. The last people who see this work in the White House. Unfortunately, he's been manipulating and conning and deceiving them ever since. Now, Israelis don't necessarily see it that way. Israelis think that he should have resigned. 70% in polls, in consistent polls. The last one of which was published yesterday, over 70% think he should resign. 67% think a new election should be held immediately when the war ends, which parenthetically is why he needs the war not to end. But aside from that, Joe Biden came up with not only a plan. Joe Biden came up with an outline or the general contours of what Israel should look out for, what Israel should expect, what's in store, what does the future have in store for Israel. And he presented a plan. You asked me to go over it, so I'll do it in very brief form. It's sequential. It is modular, meaning that you can play with the modalities, but it's sequential. Every phase needs the previous phase to work and succeed. So it begins with a hostage deal that is accompanied by a 45-day ceasefire. Without this, nothing can be done. If that happens, an international force or some kind of an international interim force will be constructed that includes a major Arab component in it. The Arab component will include Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority, in order to create a governance linkage between the West Bank and Gaza, to which Mr. Netanyahu immediately said absolutely not, and came out with this fortune cookie platitude that I will not allow Hamastan to become a Fatahstan. Okay, great. You created Hamastan, so who are you to? But that's beside the point now. Now, if that works, then negotiations will begin on a provisional future Palestinian state that will be recognized ahead of time by the U.S. amongst other countries. the idea would be recognized. You can't legally recognize a country that hasn't been established yet. And that would lead to regional coordination and a regional dialogue that would entail normalization of relations, between Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel and Qatar, and a renewed renewal of diplomatic relations with the UAE, the Emirates, and Bahrain, with which formally we still have diplomatic relations, but substantively we do not. And that would lead to some kind of a loose, not really defined yet, a regional security architecture, or some kind of a loose alliance. Not exactly in NATO, but a lot of coordination with the adversary, with the nemesis here being Iran. Because basically what the US has said to Netanyahu is that, look, we have a completely different interpretation of October 7th than you do. We think of October 7th as a point of inflection. There is no return to the status quo ante. You can't bomb your way back to October 6th. October 7th created highlighted the axis of terror and anarchy that Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and supported by Russia represent. But it also created an opportunity for an axis of stability to be constructed. And this is what we want to do. Israel didn't respond to this. The main features, the main characteristics of the plan were presented 3 or 4 times. First, it was Secretary of State Blinken. Then it was Vice President Kamala Harris who described the plan in a speech in Dubai. Then Tom Friedman of the New York Post wrote an entire op-ed, which he called the Biden Doctrine. And then the president himself divulged some of the ideas that quote unquote, the ideas that we are thinking about. Israel never responded. Now, what is tragic in all this is that everything that is in that plan are things that for decades Israel was dreaming about. Normalization and peace with the entire Arab world, disassociation or disengagement from the Palestinians, a coalition that places or defines Iran as a major threat. For God's sakes, how could you say no to this? I'm not saying take this as a package, take it or leave it type of package, but at least go into negotiations in good faith. At least say, I accept this as a framework. Now let's discuss the nuts, bolts, and details. Instead, all Netanyahu said was, the U.S. will not dictate anything to us. So,
and I mean that's kind of like the state of mind in Israel, and also I would have to say a lot regarding a lot of Israelis, also expat Israelis, is like this notion that if Biden is and the U.S. offering some vision, they're managing Israel
right.
like another state instead of like appreciating it. And I would want to connect this plan because, again, we kept talking for 30 minutes on the Gaza situation, but on the north we have Hezbollah, and
Right.
it's not that we are basically in a new situation where there is a new security area where Netanyahu and his government displaced Israelis for the first time, right? On the 4 kilometers, I think, what is it like in miles from the border. And there is no signs to going forward about how we deal with that. And I assume that we are waiting to finish the war, or not to escalate. But we could have been in a crisis with Hezbollah. I mean, but those relationship with the U.S. and stopped it. So give us like 2, 3, 4 minutes about the situation in the north, and what can we hope the U.S. to do about that, or what we are trying to get there? Try to avoid the escalation there.
Okay, two things or two elements of policy deterred Hezbollah and its backers in Iran from engaging in a war. The first was they probably didn't want to. Neither Iran nor Hezbollah, and in this respect, even though everyone thinks that Hezbollah work full-time for Iran, that's not the case. They make their own decisions. They are heavily armed and financed by Iran, but Iran doesn't call the shots in terms of policy. The second major deterrent was the U.S. was President Biden, who on his in his speech on October 10th in the White House, flanked by Kamala Harris and Antony Blinken, said, if you recall, don't. He said there are parties in the Middle East who will try to escalate this, who will try and spread and enlarge and broaden the conflict. And to them, I say, don't. He followed that by dispatching to the Mediterranean 2 aircraft carrier strike forces, the USS Gerald Ford and the USS Dwight Eisenhower. Added to that, the 26th Marine Expeditionary Strike Force, which is 2,500, 2,400 Marines strong. And that was enough to deter Hezbollah and Iran. There have been stories, we're going to have to wait for historians to delve into that, but there have been stories and reports, I don't know how accurate, that on October 11th and 12th, which is 4 or 5 days into after the October 7th and into the war, Israel was seriously contemplating a preemptive strike against Hezbollah. And that a combination of some opposition inside the cabinet and U.S. Pressure prevented Israel from doing so. Ever since ever since escalation has been on a back burner, with the U.S. defining escalation in the north as its paramount interest. I mean, preventing escalation in the north being the prime American interest. To that effect, both aircraft carriers were moved away, the Eisenhower into the Indian Ocean, and the Fords sailed back to Norfolk, Virginia. But that doesn't mean that the danger or potential of escalation has abated. It has not. And as you said correctly, as you observed correctly in what you said, Ophir, you have 150,000 Israelis who were just displaced from their homes in a 2.5-mile wide swath of land up across the entire Israel-Lebanon border. I don't know how it'll play in Lebanon, because supposedly there's no war, and both sides are exercising some level of restraint, but the fighting goes on. The exchange of fire goes on a daily basis. Just 2 days ago, Hezbollah fired over 100 rockets into northern Israel, not against civilian targets, but that they tried to target military targets. Military installations, I'm sorry. Israel, on the other hand, attacked way up in northern Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley. And so there's always the possibility of what is called a miscalculation. A miscalculation meaning inadvertent series of moves that result in an escalation that no one even planned for. And before you know it, you're engaged in a war, and you start looking back and say, what the hell did we do this for? Now, all that said and done, this is not just a military confrontation. There is a political disagreement or a political point of contention here on the exact delineation of the Israeli-Lebanese border. This is what the Americans are trying to overcome now. It's not been working. Don't forget, there's a major issue here. Hezbollah is not the Lebanese government. Hezbollah cannot negotiate, is not authorized to negotiate on behalf of the Lebanese government. On the other hand, the Lebanese government is very weak, and Hezbollah relatively politically is very strong. On the other side, which is now the third or fourth side in this equation, I don't know that Israel, I don't know, and I say this with I try to be extraordinarily cautious when I say this. I don't know that Israel can handle a full-blown war with Hezbollah right now. As long as there are forces committed to Gaza and the economy is suffering greatly because of hundreds of thousands cumulative reservists being called, there's no tourism. Israel's credit rating has been lowered. Its credit forecast has been given a negative designation. So I don't know that Israel can afford a full-blown war now.
And that connects to and I'm starting to pick up some questions. So a couple of comments. Moshe Shertov is saying that right now, as we speak, there are missiles shooting in the north. Yep. And just to clarify, the 150,000 are both from the south and the north. Probably from the north is half of it or less.
80,000. The official figure is 80,000.
80,000. But speaking about the ability to go to war, I mean, like, it's clearly that most of the ammunition, and if people doesn't know, is coming through the United States to fight for the fight in Gaza, which is one thing. And and correct me if I'm wrong, Alon, I saw a tweet from Barak Ravid, the reporter, that was saying that there is some slowdown in the rates that the munition is now coming to Israel. It might be a first signal of some kind of like tough love. I mean, I assume that we cannot really go to war with Hezbollah if we don't have the blessing or the support by getting support from the US. That's a good analysis. I mean, like, we just can't.
Look, Israel's reliance on the US for munitions is heavy. I mean, you think that a country as rich as Israel, and it's a rich country, in the upper 20 or 25% of the European Union, although we're not members of the European Union, in terms of GDP and GDP per capita, with a huge defense budget as a portion or proportion of the budget, with a huge military as a proportion of the general population, which also gets $3.8 billion a year from the US. And 10 days into the war, Israel is asking the US, begging, in fact, the US, imploring the US for emergency munitions and systems worth in excess of $14 billion. How that happened, I don't know. Where is all the munition? Well, half of it was dropped on Gaza. But going back to your question, you can't fight a war against Hezbollah, which is by far more equipped, far more better equipped with precise munitions and precise missiles than Hamas ever was. You can't go to war without a steady supply of American munitions. And so in that respect, I don't know what Barak Ravid wrote, and I don't know if that's really a sign. I mean, I know from you, and I don't know if that's a sign of tough love or that's just a technical issue. There have been threats before to provide Israel with precise munitions, but not so-called dumb bombs, because they cause devastation in Gaza and civilian or non-combatant deaths all over the place. And so the US slowed that down already during the war. There was also a decision to halt the sale of some attack helicopters. But we're not in the policy area yet. I mean, we mentioned this at the outset. Members of Congress can make speeches, and members of Congress can sign letters, and people can write op-eds in the New York Times or the Washington Post, or go on MSNBC or CNN or Fox and say whatever they want. It's not a policy yet.
Just to clarify, like, we are not, I mean, the idea that we are in this stage in the relationship between the US and Israel just, I mean, I assume make us all really, really sad. I mean, we wish we couldn't need to talk about it. And I want to connect it to something that is we didn't cover, and I want to cover it in two kind of like ways. One is we didn't talk about the rise of anti-Semitism in the US. And we didn't talk about Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the extreme right. We've kept saying Netanyahu, but Netanyahu is in coalition. He brought to the coalition Ben Gvir and Smotrich. I want to try and cover that, Alon, in two ways. One is are Israelis aware that the actions that we are taking in Israel is actually exposing us as Jewish Americans, Israeli Americans, and the Jewish around the world to anti-Semitism? And again, I want to be very clear. I mean, anti-Semitism that was rise post-October 7 has a lot of anti-Israeli into it, but it does feels like we are being attacked here locally. I mean, so that's one question. And the other question is like, is the actions and the relationship of Netanyahu and America is driven by, by what Senator Majority Chuck Schumer said, that he lost his way because he brought those extremists to the government. So how do you connect all those points together?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'll try and connect, but you asked 6 different questions here.
Sorry about that.
I'll try and connect. First of all, Israelis don't think that Israel is causing anti-Semitism. They conveniently think that anti-Semitism was always there, that anti-Semitism has its own indigenous sources, and that this goes back to more or less the crucifixion of Jesus, and even before that, there was anti-Semitism. Okay. So they don't make it necessarily, they don't make the causal relationship between, or connection rather, between Israel's actions and anti-Semitism. Obviously it exists because some of Israel's actions put you in America in grave danger. That doesn't mean that Israel needs to change its policy because it's making life in San Francisco or New York less comfortable. But it doesn't mean that Israel, as long as it thinks of itself as the state of the Jews, needs to be slightly more cognizant and a lot more responsible on what it does, because if it is the state of the Jews, then you are endangering Jews. But I'll tell you more than that. You're also you being the government, not you will feel. You're also endangering Jews living in Israel. So even before I'm thinking about San Francisco or New York or Chicago, it's happening right here now. Your second or third question related to what Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Look, let's not forget that the U.S.'s administration, the Biden administration's position on Netanyahu did not begin on October 7th. It was preceded, and this is where unacceptable was born. It was preceded by 9 full months of a constitutional coup in which he tried to turn Israel into an authoritarian, semi-authoritarian or quasi-theocracy with those 2 gentlemen, Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Ben Gvir and Smotrich are a stain not only on Israel, but on Judaism. And America has said so. In the weeks of December, in the last 2 weeks of December 2022, when Mr. Netanyahu was forming a coalition following the November election, Americans, when I say Americans, I mean administration or members of Congress, warned him not to form a coalition with these people. He did. And then 5 days after he sworn in his government on December 29th, 6 days later, on January 4th, he launched with his justice minister the constitutional coup, which they so handsomely called a
judicial reform.
A judicial reform. That's like calling a bank robbery a financial rearrangement, because it's not true, but we know what we're looking at. And a bank robbery is in a way a financial rearrangement, the same way that his judicial reform is a constitutional coup. And so if you recall, and I'm sure you do, certainly you, For 9 whole months, the president not only condemned Israel, but refrained from inviting him to the White House, which is unheard of, since the late 60s, when Levi Eshkol was first invited to the White House. And so the American displeasure and discontent with Israel began before the war. Then came the war. And when the war began, the Americans were thinking, when I say the Americans, I mean the administration, obviously, how could he manage this war with those two reckless clowns, driven by some messianic and biblical dictates? And they said, okay, and maybe he'll put in, maybe he'll bring in Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, which he did, which sort of changed the balance, but did not change his demeanor. And then the Americans, a few months later, found out that Mr. Gantz and Mr. Eisenkot are not really making a substantial qualitative difference. And so now, I think, based on what I know, the Americans would love to see them go out of the government, which explains Mr. Schumer, the Senator Schumer, Majority Leader Schumer's speech yesterday on the Senate floor, in which not only did he express his displeasure with Mr. Netanyahu, but also called for a new election. I hope that answers everything you asked.
Yep, that's answered the question, and that's bring us to the almost the last part of the conversation. And the question would be, if you look into, I mean, you mentioned our work on the ground here during the judicial overhaul. And the ability of us maybe to create a momentum. Actually, it's just about a year ago. We almost forgot that we had the Shame on Smotrich rally, but because Smotrich was not welcomed anywhere in DC on his meetings, and this was 2 weeks after he was calling to wipe Hawara. But the reality is that the question that we keep asking ourselves, I mean, assuming that we want to help. Bringing Israel, again, to save Israeli democracy, we know that we need to find a way to keep it Jewish and democratic. We need to find a way to get to a two-state or some kind of security solution. So we're not governing another 7 million Palestinians between the river and the sea, or 5. And we do know that we need to find a way to remove Messianic Zionists from the wheels of the country. On the political side, do you have any sense of what Jewish and Israeli Americans can do from here?
No. I hope. Here's the thing. You've done great until now. Unacceptable. The majority of American Jews went completely numb and silent and cocooned themselves throughout the constitutional coup. I can't blame them. I don't blame them. I understand the the situation they found themselves in. I understand their ideological and political predicament. But right now, let's look at where we are now. These changes that you're talking about, a political change, a change in the composition of the coalition, even under a different prime minister. A process that would lead to some kind of disengagement from the Palestinians. Not a Palestinian state tomorrow morning. That's not even viable. And I don't think anyone's taking that seriously, except Mr. Netanyahu, who's building an entirely prefabricated, bogus campaign over that. But all these things need to happen in Israel. They can't happen in New York. They can't happen in San Francisco. They can't happen in Chicago. Yeah, you can go and demonstrate, free the hostages, out with Netanyahu, and that's important. And I'm not saying you shouldn't. I think it creates pressure too. And you should write your congressman, and which is something you need to do every day. And you should urge your members of Congress and your senators from the states you're from to be more vocal and to be more critical. In that respect, Chuck Schumer opened the door. But in the end, Ophir and all the friends that are here on this call, it's up to us. it's up to us right here in Israel. I'm sure you'll hear things that are similar to that next week or whenever you said my good friend Yair Golan is speaking to you. He's trying to make the change. I hope he succeeds, but you know, it's going to take much more than one Yair Golan to make this happen. There needs to be an election. So everything now needs to be focused on a new election. You know, you would think that fundamental decency and fundamental a fundamental moral fabric would lead Netanyahu to resign on October 7th, November 7th, December 7th, up to and including March 7th. It didn't. So since he's not going to resign for whatever reasons, because he doesn't think it's like he said, FDR didn't resign after Pearl Harbor. Well, he forgot that Saddam Hussein also didn't resign after the war in Iraq. So this claim that he keeps on making, the others didn't resign, so ergo I don't need to resign. That's obviously nonsense. But since he's not going to resign, the main focus of public outcry, and I hope it grows, I have to admit, I don't see the energies there yet. Perhaps because there is a war still going on, which also explains why he has a vested interest in prolonging an atmosphere of a war, even if it's not actually a war. It needs to all focus on a new election. Everything has to be about a new election. Now, what Chuck Schumer did enables you and provides you with a good opportunity, because Schumer called for an election too. So now you can follow Schumer, being Americans. Okay, what Israelis need to do, Israelis need to do. But now you can call for an election in Israel without being accused of meddling in Israeli politics, because the leader of the majority in the United States Senate called for a new election. So you're good on that. That's about the extent of what I think you may be able to do.
I know it's kind of like frustrating to be from far away and to see what's happening.
You think it's easier here?
No, I don't think it's easier here. I said it's frustrating, and I think that again, I mean, like, especially when we know that it's affecting us. I mean, again, we are not on the fence with Gaza or Lebanon, but it does affect us here. The policies that are being taken, I would say that just for everyone on the call, I mean, follow us on the website. There is a link tree. There are protests starting in Los Angeles, in New York, in other places. And we will probably announce something coming up very soon. And last but not least, we have like 3 more minutes. There are calls for. I mean, the word ceasefire in America is obviously very triggering, right? Yeah. And it's triggering the word peace, the word ceasefire, the word two-state solution. I mean, triggering from different areas, but the ceasefire specifically is connected to something that mostly we are seeing those calls for a ceasefire no matter what. By pro-Hamas, anti-Israel Israelis, and city halls meetings and others. What do you think how do you think we should handle it? Because we all understand that in order to bring them home, we must have a stop in the war. How do you handle it when you're being asked on the news about it, for example?
First of all, the administration has never asked for a ceasefire. The administration used all these euphemisms. Extended humanitarian pauses, cessation of hostilities, and all kinds of words that are the euphemisms or fall short of asking for a ceasefire. In the context of a hostage deal, it's the first time that the U.S. is talking about an extended ceasefire. Not an indefinite ceasefire, but an extended ceasefire. I think Vice President Kamala Harris spoke about that a week ago, about a ceasefire. I don't think you should be calling for a ceasefire because here's the thing, because it falls exactly into the discourse that Israel's detractors are using. Now, there is a distinction which I'm hesitant to make, but I will on this call. Some people will say this sounds like newspeak from George Orwell's 1984, but there really is a difference between the end of the war and the end of fighting. The war on terrorism always goes on. So what I'm saying is you can end the war and still continue necessary or so-called intelligence-driven operations, even inside Gaza, without this being a general war. I'm not saying that's impossible, and I'm not advocating it because I know you will always have people saying, "What the hell are you talking about? What is this Orwellian language that you're employing here?" But you should focus on a hostage deal because it comes as a package with, or is accompanied by at least a 45-day ceasefire. So rather than talk about a ceasefire, talk about the hostage deal. Beyond the hostage deal, whether it happens or not, I would urge a lot of you to be more open in endorsing and embracing Biden's plan. Not because it's a perfect plan, not because it lacks or it has all the components or even if it lacks some security. It's the framework that Israel should be happy to engage in rather than reject it offhandedly and dismissively the way Mr. Netanyahu did 2 weeks ago. Yeah.
And there was a question about the day after plan of Netanyahu, but I kind of like avoided another question, not because it's not a good one, because there is no actually one that he was presenting, as far as I know, right?
There is.
Well, okay, let's talk about it.
Okay. There's no plan. But under pressure from the U.S. to at least respond to the plans that the U.S. Put on the table, a month and a half after the U.S. came out with that Biden plan that included the first portion, which is the ceasefire, the hostage deal, the ceasefire, and the international force in Gaza to govern Gaza instead of Hamas. Under pressure to say something, Netanyahu came out with a 1.5-page list of statements that reads, I know I've used that before, so I'll use it again. It's right out of fortune cookies. You know, just these little slips of platitudes. We will do this, and we will do this, and we will do this, and we will not allow this, and we will not allow this, and we will never have this, and we will not agree to this, and we will never consent to that. That's not a plan. That's a list of ideas, statements, platitudes, cliches, call it what you want. Some of them seem valid. Some of them are completely outlandish. What it basically says is preserve and sanctify the status quo. Meaning, if you look at what Netanyahu's office put out, by the way, it was put out at 2:30 a.m. Okay, that's an odd thing to do when you come out.
It's about the same time he was tweeting about the generals in the army that there are. Maybe it's in the Miami time clock time frame. I don't know.
That's very.
I want to thank you very much, Alon, for being with us. I know it's late on Friday night in Israel, and you probably have 2 more discussions with the news channels.
No, well, yeah, MSNBC, but that's much later.
That's much later, even much later.
That's in the middle. That's in the middle of the night in Israel.
Yeah, and I want to thank everyone who took the time over Friday noontime and afternoon. So everyone, Shabbat Shalom, and I'll see you next week with a discussion with Golan. And make sure to sign up to the newsletter so you know about the next ones. Thank you, Alon, and thank you, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Been a pleasure.